The wind at the bottom of the world does not howl. It screams. It is a constant physical weight against the reinforced walls of Outpost Novus, a sound so absolute and unending that the human brain eventually has to filter it out just to maintain sanity. 18 people, 14 months, one international polar research station sitting on a permanent ice shelf where the temperature routinely drops to -70 degrees. In this kind of isolation, the world strips you down. Oh, there is no room for performance, no space for the masks people wear in civilization. The cold burns away everything that is not strictly necessary for survival. Elias Thorne understood this better than anyone. He was the station commander, an alpha in his mid-30s who had built his entire life on the foundation of discipline, logistics, and control. He had done 2 previous rotations on the ice. He knew how the dark season chewed on the edges of people's minds. He knew how to manage the friction of 18 different personalities trapped in a steel can for over a year. He was a man composed of hard angles and quiet authority, smelling faintly of dark coffee, aged leather, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone before a storm. His crew trusted him implicitly because Elias did not make mistakes. He did not let emotion cloud his judgment. He believed that leadership meant maintaining an impenetrable emotional distance. He believed he was the anchor that kept the station from tearing itself apart. He was wrong. The one blind spot Elias possessed was the arrogant belief that the people who mattered would always be waiting for him when he finally decided to turn around. Julian did not fit into Elias's perfectly ordered world. Julian was the station's meteorologist, an Omega in his mid-20s on his first polar assignment. Where Elias was forged from rigid discipline, Julian was composed of terrifying, unapologetic precision. He was gentle on the surface, moving through the cramped corridors of the station with a quiet grace, carrying the warm, grounding scent of dried lavender and sea salt. But beneath that soft exterior was a spine made of pure titanium. Julian did not soften his words to spare people's feelings. He treated data with a reverence most people reserved for religion, and he delivered his findings with a bluntness that had caused immense professional friction at his previous postings. He observed the weather because the weather was the only system honest enough to be properly studied. It did not lie. It did not perform. It simply was. Their dynamic was established on day 9 of the rotation. The station was still settling into its rhythms when Julian walked into the central command room. He did not knock. He walked straight to the main console, as bypassing 2 senior engineers, and placed a highly detailed, aggressively annotated atmospheric chart on the metal table. He looked directly at Elias, his dark eyes unblinking, and delivered the news. The resupply mission was going to be delayed. The atmospheric pressure systems forming over the coastal ridge were compounding into a massive, stationary storm front. The delay would be 6 weeks minimum, possibly 8. The room went dead silent. The engineers stared at the young Omega, waiting for the Alpha Commander to reprimand him for his tone, for his lack of deference, for delivering catastrophic news without a hint of hesitation. Elias looked at the chart. He looked at the data. He asked 3 highly technical questions about the wind shear and the barometric drop. Julian answered all 3 without missing a beat, his voice steady, his scent completely devoid of the sour spike of anxiety that usually accompanied an Omega speaking to an Alpha of Elias's standing. Elias stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Thank you," Elias said. He immediately turned to the communications panel and began the grueling process of reorganizing the station's logistics, recalculating the caloric rationing, and revising the power consumption schedules for 18 people trapped in the ice for 2 months longer than planned. He did not blame the messenger. He did not question the Omega's expertise. In that single fleeting moment, a profound and silent respect took root in Julian's chest. Over the next several months, the reality of the prolonged isolation began to warp the social fabric of the station. 14 months in a contained space does things to people. The artificial lights hummed constantly. The smell of recycled air and unwashed bodies grew oppressive. small annoyances magnified into screaming matches. Some relationships intensified into desperate, clinging things, while others shattered completely. No, Elias managed it all with a steady, omnipresent attention. He broke up fights in the mess hall. He mediated disputes over shower times and bandwidth usage. He was everywhere, a stoic guardian pacing the perimeter of his territory. Julian watched him. Julian observed the social dynamics of the station with the same clinical detached fascination he applied to the storm fronts outside. He saw the pressure points. He saw where the fractures were forming. By month 4, Aunt Julian's own precision had become a source of contention. 3 members of the engineering team had developed a severe, venomous friction with him. They hated his bluntness. They hated that an Omega half their age was constantly correcting their thermal output calculations. Elias pulled Julian into the command room one evening to discuss it. It was not a reprimand. Elias leaned against the reinforced window, the eternal whiteout raging behind him, and told Julian that his delivery was causing unnecessary drag on the team's morale. Julian stood his ground, his arms crossed, his lavender scent spiking with defensive sea salt. If the information is correct, Julian argued, how I say it shouldn't matter. The data is the data. Elias looked at him, his expression softening just a fraction, the ozone scent of his alpha nature wrapping around Julian like a heavy blanket. You're right that it shouldn't, Elias said quietly. You're wrong that it doesn't. Julian stared at him, his jaw tight. He did not argue further. He took the criticism, held it in his chest, and sat with it for 2 weeks. And then, slowly, imperceptibly, he adjusted. He started couching his corrections in softer language. He started bringing the engineers hot tea when he delivered the revised schematics. He compromised his own rigid boundaries for the sake of the station's harmony. Elias noticed the change. He noticed the immense effort it took for Julian to bend. Elias said nothing, but the dark coffee warmth of his scent flared with deep, unspoken approval every time Julian walked into the room. Then the dark season arrived. 4 months of absolute, unbroken night. The sun dipped below the horizon and did not return. The psychological toll of the perpetual darkness was catastrophic. The station descended into a collective, suffocating depression. Sleep cycles shattered. People began hallucinating shadows in the corners of the corridors. Julian, whose entire life was governed by the observation of light and weather, developed a crippling case of insomnia. He began spending his nights in the upper observation deck, a small, glass-domed room at the highest point of the station, staring out into the pitch-black void. It was there, at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, that Elias found him. Elias did not ask for permission. He simply walked into the freezing observation room, his heavy boots echoing on the metal grating, and sat down in the chair next to Julian. They sat in silence for 20 minutes. The wind screamed against the glass. Finally, Elias leaned his head back against the bulkhead and spoke. "How's the pressure system?" he asked. Julian did not look away from the window. He knew Elias was not asking about the atmosphere outside. "Unstable, but manageable," Julian replied, his voice barely above a whisper. That was how it started. The observation room became their sanctuary. It was not every night, but several times a week. In the dead hours when the rest of the station was lost to restless sleep, the Alpha and the Omega would find themselves sitting side by side in the dark. The conversation started small, focused on the structural integrity of the ice shelf and the rationing of the hydroponic bay, but slowly the darkness peeled back their defenses. They began to talk about the things that existed outside the ice. Elias spoke about his life before the station. He grew up in a landlocked, suffocatingly small town, driven to polar research because he desperately needed to understand what was largest in the world. He needed to be dwarfed by something to feel alive. Julian listened, his scent washing over Elias in soothing waves of lavender and warm bread. Julian spoke of the ocean. He grew up on the coast, a child of the tides. He became a meteorologist because he could not stand the performative nature of human society. "The weather doesn't lie," Julian said one night, his knees pulled up to his chest. It doesn't pretend to be calm when it's furious. It doesn't smile at you while it's planning to destroy your house. It is the only honest thing I have ever known. Elias turned his head, looking at the soft curve of Julian's profile in the dim light of the instrument panels. A low and genuine laugh rumbled in the Alpha's chest. "Neither do you," Elias murmured. Julian smiled, a small, fragile thing. "I know," Julian said softly. "It's been professionally difficult." The intimacy between them grew, a slow tectonic shift beneath the surface of their professional boundaries. The air between them became thick, charged with an unspoken gravitational pull. By month 8, the tension was nearly unbearable. Then the primary heating system failed. It happened during the coldest week of the year. The station's core temperature plummeted rapidly. The repair required 3 days of grueling, controlled panic. Everyone in the station worked around the clock, wearing heavy thermal gear indoors, their breath pluming in the freezing corridors. Elias coordinated the crisis with terrifying efficiency. He was a machine, a force of nature, directing the engineering teams, managing the auxiliary power, near keeping 18 terrified people from descending into hysteria. Julian was right beside him the entire time, running the thermal degradation models, his fingers bruised and bleeding from the cold metal keyboards. On the third night, at 2:47 in the morning, the primary boiler finally ignited. The deep, mechanical thrum of the heating system vibrated through the floorboards. Warm air blasted through the vents. A collective, weeping sigh of relief echoed through the station. Down in the engineering bay, Elias stood staring at the primary gauge. When the needle hit the green zone, all the strength simply evaporated from his body. The invincible commander collapsed. He slid down the metal bulkhead and hit the floor, pulling his knees up, closing his eyes as his chest heaved. He was entirely spent. A moment later, he felt a soft weight settle against his side. Julian sat down on the filthy floor next to him. The Omega did not speak. He just pressed his shoulder against Elias's arm, offering his warmth, his scent blooming into a rich, overwhelming wave of pure, concentrated comfort. Elias turned his face into Julian's hair and breathed him in. The Alpha's walls finally cracked. It came out slowly in the days following the repair. The secret Elias carried. He had a daughter. She was 7 years old. He had joint custody, and she was living with her mother during this rotation. He kept a small, worn photograph of her tucked inside the lining of his command jacket. But he never displayed it. He never spoke of her to the crew. He had learned during his first rotation that speaking about the people you loved made the distance a physical agony. It made the ice feel like a tomb. But one evening in the observation deck, Julian noticed the edge of the photograph peeking out of Elias's pocket. Julian asked about her, his voice impossibly gentle. Elias froze. And then he answered. He told Julian about her laugh. He told him about how she liked to categorize her crayons by emotional resonance rather than color. After that night, Julian would ask about her occasionally. Just small questions. What is her favorite book? Does she like the snow? And Elias would answer, feeling a profound, staggering relief. Julian had given him permission to be a father again, even at the bottom of the world. With 2 months left in the rotation, the atmosphere in the station shifted. The resupply vessel was finally on its way. The reality of their return to civilization hung over them like a descending blade. The specific, isolated world they had built, the compressed intimacy, the freedom from ordinary consequences, was ending. Neither Elias nor Julian spoke of it directly. Instead, they adjusted their behavior in small, agonizing ways that were the exact opposite of pulling back. They lingered too long in doorways. Their hands brushed over the data consoles. Elias found himself tracking Julian's scent through the station, feeling a low, possessive growl in his chest whenever another Alpha stood too close to the Omega. He wanted to claim him. He wanted to pin Julian to the wall of the observation deck, and bite the claiming mark into his neck, binding them together before the real world could tear them apart. But Elias was the commander. He was disciplined. He told himself he would wait. He would wait until they were off the ice. He thought love was something that could be scheduled. He thought he had time. The fatal mistake did not happen all at once. It was a compounding series of arrogant assumptions. It was month 13. The tension in the station was at a boiling point. The crew was exhausted, paranoid, and desperate to go home. A violent brawl had broken out in the mess hall between two of the junior engineers over a stolen ration of coffee. Elias was in the middle of it, physically pulling a bleeding alpha off a beta, his own alpha pheromones flaring aggressively to force submission in the room. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and sour adrenaline. While Elias was dealing with the chaos, Julian was outside. He had suited up in his heavy thermal gear and taken a snowcat out to Sector 4, a remote sensor array 3 miles from the main station. The barometric pressure data from Sector 4 had been reporting anomalous fluctuations for 2 days. Julian, with his relentless need for precision, refused to leave the anomaly unchecked. He went alone. He shouldn't have gone alone. But Julian had spent the last 13 months protecting Elias from his own worry. He knew Elias was stressed. He knew the commander was holding the station together by a thread. Julian didn't want to add to his burden. So he went out into the howling whiteout by himself. And he found the problem. It wasn't a weather anomaly. The sensor array had been deliberately tampered with. The primary data cables had been slashed. And beneath the snow, Julian found the secondary fuel line that ran from the emergency depot to the main station. It had been severed. Someone was bleeding the station's emergency fuel reserves into the ice. Corporate sabotage. Julian dropped to his knees in the snow, his breath catching in his throat. He pulled off his heavy glove and traced the clean, precise cut on the reinforced pipe. It wasn't an accident. Someone inside their crew, someone they had lived with for over a year, was trying to ensure the station failed before the resupply ship arrived. Julian stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached for his shoulder radio. He pressed the transmission button. Back in the mess hall, Elias had just pinned the aggressive engineer to the floor when his radio crackled. The green light on his shoulder mic blinked frantically. Julian's designated frequency. Elias gritted his teeth, wiping a smear of blood from his cheek. He looked down at the blinking light. He was surrounded by screaming crew members trying to re-establish order. He thought of Julian's obsessive, uncompromising nature. He thought of the Omega's tendency to panic over a 3 millibar drop in atmospheric pressure. He's just anxious about the wind shear, Elias thought, his alpha pride blinding him to the reality of the moment. Always like this. Always pushing the data when I'm trying to keep these people from killing each other. I'll call him back when this is sorted. Elias reached up with a steady, commanding hand and switched his radio receiver to mute. He silenced the channel. He silenced his Omega. He thought he was being strong. He thought he was compartmentalizing the crisis. He did not know he was making the single most devastating decision of his life. Out in the freezing wasteland of Sector 4, Julian stared at his radio in horror as the transmission light flipped from green to a dead, hollow red. Connection terminated. He pressed the button again. Elias, pick up. Please. The radio hissed with static. Julian's breath hitched. A shadow detached itself from the massive steel leg of the sensor tower. Julian spun around. Standing 10 feet away, holding a heavy, serrated ice cutter, was Miller, the senior logistics officer, the man who had eaten dinner with them every night, the man who had helped Julian fix his atmospheric gauges in month 3. Miller's eyes were dead. He didn't say a word. He just raised the cutter and lunged. Julian ran. The shattering of Elias Thorne happened exactly 42 minutes later. The mess hall was finally secured. The combatants were locked in separate quarters. Elias washed the blood off his hands in the stainless steel sink of the command room, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He poured himself a cup of stale coffee. He walked over to the main communications console to check the logs. He reached down and unmuted his radio. The console screen flashed. 3 missed emergency transmissions, all from Julian, all flagged with the highest priority distress code. Elias froze. The coffee cup in his hand trembled. A cold, sickening dread began to pool in the pit of his stomach. He pressed the playback button. The first voicemail filled the quiet command room. Julian's voice was tight, breathless, the sound of the howling wind bleeding through the mic. Elias, the pressure in Sector 4 isn't weather. The cables are cut. The emergency fuel line is severed. Someone is sabotaging the outpost. I'm coming back. Please copy. Elias stopped breathing. His hand tightened around the ceramic mug. He hit the next message. The second voicemail was pure, unfiltered terror. The sound of heavy boots crunching desperately through deep snow. Elias, please answer, please. It's Miller. He's out here. He cut the lines. He saw me. He has a cutter. Elias, my snowcat is disabled. He cut the ignition wires. I'm on foot. Please answer the radio. The ceramic mug shattered in Elias's hand. Hot coffee and blood dripped from his fingers onto the metal floor. He didn't feel it. His heart was violently slamming against his rib cage. He slammed his bloody fist onto the console to play the final message. The third voicemail was a sound Elias would hear in his nightmares until the day he died. It was the sound of a dying animal. The wind was deafening. Julian was gasping, weeping, his voice completely fractured. The audio was distorted by the violent shivering of his body. Elias, I can't outrun him in the snow. I'm bleeding. He clipped my leg. The cold. It's burning. I'm locking myself in the tertiary pump station. The power is dead inside. The comms are dying. I didn't tell you yet. I took the test from the med bay this morning, before I left. I'm pregnant, Elias. Our baby. I was going to tell you tonight. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I love you. The transmission cut to dead, hissing static. Elias stood perfectly still. The silence in the command room was absolute. A man known for his steady hands, a man who commanded military operations, a man who had never broken under the weight of the ice, completely and utterly shattered. He did not cry, he did not scream. His physical reaction was entirely alien. His throat closed, sealing off his airway. His knees simply gave out. He collapsed onto the floor, clutching his chest, his mouth opening in a silent, agonizing scream. The air turned to glass in his lungs. The agony was not a fire. It was absolute zero. It froze the blood in his veins. He had muted the radio. He had silenced the only call that mattered. Julian had been out there in the dark, terrified, hunted, carrying their unborn child, begging for help. And Elias had ignored him because he thought he knew better. The guilt was a physical violence, tearing him apart from the inside out. He knelt in the spilled coffee and his own blood, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't push himself off the floor. When Elias finally stood, the station commander was dead. The man who rose from the floor was something else entirely. He was an alpha stripped of his humanity, reduced to a terrifying primordial core of grief and vengeance. The descent was quiet. It terrified the crew more than any screaming rage ever could. Elias did not sound the general alarm. He did not rally a search party. He moved through the station like a ghost. He walked down the corridor to Julian's quarters. He bypassed the lock. The room was immaculate. The scent of lavender, vanilla, and warm bread still lingered in the air. A ghost of the Omega who had lived there. Elias walked to the small desk. Sitting perfectly centered on the metal table was a white plastic stick, with 2 pink lines. Next to it was a small, hand-drawn chart of the atmospheric pressure, annotated with a tiny, smiling sun in the corner. Julian had drawn it for him. Julian had known. He had chosen Elias. He had been protecting Elias, carrying this secret, waiting for the right moment. Elias picked up the pregnancy test. He held it to his face. He inhaled the fading scent of his mate. The grief solidified into a block of pure, unbreakable ice in his chest. He made a vow. cold, final, unhurried. Elias walked back to the central command room. He locked the heavy blast doors from the inside. He sat down at the master terminal. He typed in his command override codes. He initiated a station-wide lockdown. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over every window. The exterior airlock sealed with a deafening hydraulic hiss. No one was leaving. Then he began the hunt. Elias accessed the internal tracking system. He located Miller's biometric signature. The traitor was in the lower engineering bay, likely trying to sabotage the backup generators to finish the job. Elias didn't send security. He did not use the intercom. He mirrored the crime. What Miller had done to Julian, Elias was going to return in kind, but worse and infinitely slower. Elias shut down the power grid to the lower engineering bay. He plunged the sector into absolute pitch-black darkness. He turned off the heating vents in that specific quadrant. He let the ambient temperature of the Antarctic ice bleed through the hull. He wanted Miller to feel the exact terror Julian had felt, the biting, agonizing cold, the blinding dark, the absolute certainty that you are alone and hunted. Elias descended the emergency stairwell, his heavy boots making no sound on the metal grate. He was a predator in his own domain. He carried a heavy, solid steel wrench in his right hand. Down in the darkness, Miller realized what was happening. The traitor's radio crackled to life. It was Elias. The Alpha's voice was not a shout. It was a low, dead whisper that echoed through the freezing corridors. "Run," Elias said. Miller ran. The hunt was methodical. Elias stalked him through the labyrinth of pipes and conduits. Every time Miller tried to access a door, Elias remotely locked it, funneling the traitor deeper into the freezing bowels of the station. Miller screamed for help. He begged the other crew members over the open radio channel. Though Elias had jammed the frequencies, no one could hear him. Just like no one had heard Julian, Miller's scent saturated the air with the putrid metallic stench of pure terror. He stumbled, shivering violently as the temperature in the bay dropped below zero. He fell against a frozen pipe, sobbing. Elias stepped out of the shadows. He didn't say a word. He swung the heavy steel wrench, shattering Miller's kneecap. The traitor screamed, collapsing onto the frozen floor. Elias stood over him, his face a hollow mask of absolute zero. "Why?" Elias asked, his voice devoid of any human inflection. Miller gasped, clutching his shattered leg, coughing up blood. "Corporate. They paid me. The research data. It threatens their patent models. I was just supposed to freeze the station, force an evacuation, destroy the drives." Elias stared down at him. "You touched my Omega. You hunted my pregnant mate in the snow." Elias raised the wrench again. He did not kill Miller quickly. He broke his other leg. He shattered his collarbone. He dragged the screaming, bleeding traitor to the exterior airlock of the lower bay. He threw Miller inside the small steel chamber. He sealed the inner door. He looked at Miller through the reinforced glass. Then Elias initiated the external purge. He opened the outer door just a crack, letting the -70-degree wind scream into the airlock. He left Miller there to freeze, inch by agonizing inch, listening to the man beg until his vocal cords crystallized and snapped. But vengeance did not bring Julian back. The blood on Elias's hands did not warm the absolute void in his chest. When Miller was finally silent, Elias turned away. He walked to the equipment locker. He put on his extreme thermal survival gear. He grabbed a heavy emergency medical kit, a thermal blanket, and a portable plasma torch. He opened the main airlock and stepped out into the screaming whiteout. Though the storm was a physical wall of ice and darkness. The wind shear was so violent it threatened to tear him off his feet. The visibility was less than 2 feet. Elias didn't care. He ignited the plasma torch, using the blue flame to cut through the blinding snow, and marched towards Sector 4. 3 miles. It took him 2 hours of agonizing, brutal labor, dragging his body through waist-deep snowdrifts, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning with the sub-zero air. He reached the tertiary pump station. It was a small, reinforced concrete bunker, half buried under a massive snowdrift. The heavy steel door was frozen shut. Elias dropped to his knees. He used his bare, gloved hands to dig frantically through the ice. He used the plasma torch to melt the frozen locking mechanism. He kicked the heavy steel door with all his remaining strength. It groaned and gave way. Elias stumbled inside. The bunker was pitch black and freezing. The power was dead. Julian? Elias choked out, his voice cracking. The Alpha commander completely undone. Silence. He activated his shoulder light. The beam cut through the darkness. In the far corner of the room, curled into a tight, impossible ball behind the rusted pump machinery, was Julian. He was covered in frost. His lips were blue. His breathing was so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Blood was frozen in a dark streak down his thigh where the cutter had grazed him. Elias dropped the torch. He fell to his knees. Sliding across the concrete floor, he pulled Julian into his arms. The Omega was freezing, his skin like marble. The scent of lavender was almost entirely gone, replaced by the terrifying, odorless smell of death. Julian, please, please, Elias sobbed, pressing his face against Julian's frozen cheek. He ripped open his own thermal jacket. He tore open Julian's frozen coat, pulling the Omega against his bare chest, trying to transfer his own core body heat. He wrapped the heavy thermal blanket around both of them. He activated the emergency chemical heat packs and shoved them into Julian's armpits and groin. Please don't leave me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't listen. I didn't listen to you. Julian's eyelashes fluttered. The movement was so small Elias almost missed it. A tiny fractured breath escaped the Omega's lips. Elias, Julian whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves. I'm here, baby. I've got you. You're safe. Julian's uncoordinated, freezing hand twitched against Elias's chest. I'm sorry, Julian slurred, his brain misfiring from the profound hypothermia. I didn't run fast enough. The pressure dropped. I should have run faster. Elias buried his face in Julian's frost-covered hair, weeping openly, the tears freezing instantly on his cheeks. No, you did everything right. I failed you. I will never, ever stop listening to you again. I swear to God, just stay with me. The resurrection was not graceful. It was messy, agonizing, and terrifying. Elias carried Julian back to the main station through the storm, screaming at the remaining crew to prep the medical bay. The next 48 hours were a blur of IV lines, thermal baths, and the terrifying silence of the fetal heart monitor. Elias did not leave Julian's side. He sat in the plastic chair next to the medical bed, holding Julian's bruised hand, staring at the screen. When the faint, a rapid thrumming of the baby's heartbeat finally echoed through the small room, Elias collapsed forward, burying his face in the mattress, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, violent sobs. Julian reached out, his fingers weakly tangling in Elias's hair. The Omega's scent was slowly returning, weak but undeniably warm, lavender and sea salt pushing back the sterile smell of the medical bay. I'm okay, Julian whispered. We're okay. Elias turned his head, looking up at the man who had survived the ice, the man who had survived Elias's own arrogance. The Alpha pressed his lips to Julian's palm. I will spend the rest of my life making this right, Elias vowed, his voice thick with absolute devotion. Time has a way of thawing even the deepest ice. 14 months ended. The resupply vessel arrived. The station team loaded out. The authorities took Miller's frozen, crippled body into custody. Julian took one last set of atmospheric readings. Because he always took the readings. Elias did the final station checks because he always did the checks. They left together, the last two off the ice. As the vessel pulled away, crushing the frozen water beneath its heavy hull, the station shrank into the white horizon. Neither of them looked back. They were already looking at what came next. The world back home was loud and full of options. The specific freedom of it was overwhelming after 14 months of bounded space. But they navigated it together. Julian's insomnia did not follow him home. He found that he could sleep deeply, safely, anchored by the heavy, dark coffee scent of his Alpha. 8 months later, in a small house with a sprawling lavender garden in the backyard, the epilogue of their survival played out in the quiet domesticity they had earned. Elias's daughter was 8 years old now. She had met Julian with the direct, uncompromising assessment of a child who had decided to have an opinion. She had stood in the living room, hands on her hips, and looked at the pregnant Omega sitting on the couch. "Do you know what clouds are made of?" she had asked him. Julian had smiled, his eyes crinkling. "Yes," he said. "Can you tell me?" she demanded. He did. He explained the condensation of water vapor, the barometric pressure, the precise science of the sky. She listened intently. Then she nodded, climbing onto the couch and pressing her ear against Julian's swollen belly. She approved. It was the only approval that mattered in the household, and everyone present understood this. It was a Tuesday morning. The sunlight was streaming through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Julian was standing at the stove, humming softly, flipping pancakes. The baby, a healthy, loud little boy, was asleep in the bassinet by the table. Elias was sitting at the kitchen island, going over a logistics report for his new desk-bound job at the Polar Institute. But he had refused to ever go back to the ice. His world was right here, in this kitchen. Suddenly, the sharp ring of a cell phone shattered the quiet morning. It was Julian's phone, sitting on the counter near the stove. Julian was holding a hot pan, his hands full. "Oh, Elias, can you grab that?" Julian asked, not looking away from the stove. "It's probably the pediatrician reminding us about the appointment." Elias didn't hesitate. He didn't finish reading his sentence. He didn't tell himself he would call back later. The Alpha dropped his pen instantly. He stood up, crossed the kitchen in 2 massive strides, and picked up the phone before it could even finish its first ring. He answered it. He always answered it now. He would never, for the rest of his breathing life, let a single call from his Omega go unanswered again.